Good afternoon, folks. We're going to wait another minute or two, see if anybody else joins us. I have 13:01 on my clock. I'll give it 13:02 and then we'll get started. Thanks for joining us today. For those of you concerned about the weather in central Pennsylvania, it's a cool 65 degrees today with very low humidity. If you live in the Southwest or the Western United States, I feel sorry for you given the temperatures you've experienced lately. Good afternoon. Welcome to another Provident webinar. I'm your host, Ed Mann, Director of Training and Education. Today, I'm excited to introduce Jack Sullivan, Director of Training for the First Responder Learning Network. In a few moments, I'll have Jack introduce himself and tell you about his career. I met Jack so many years ago, I can't tell you exactly when, but I know it had everything to do with highway traffic safety. And I've been fortunate over the years to be able to watch Jack in action in many of his classes. And I can tell you he's very passionate about the subject and for some very deep personal reasons that I'm sure Jack will explain in his introduction. The number of first responders injured or killed on our highways each year seems to be on the rise, despite the work being done by so many to better protect our people. The rhetorical question I have for our listeners is rather simple. Are you doing everything to protect yourself and your people when working on our highways? I know Jack will leave you with plenty of good, easy to implement ideas for protecting your people. I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions throughout the program, and we're asking you to use the question and answer feature to send your questions, and we will attempt to have Jack answer all of them. Please note, if we can't get all of them answered in our allotted time, we'll get an answer to you via email in the days following the webinar. Now, a brief introduction of Provident and the company I work for, and I might say I'm very happy and proud to work for. Provident got its start in 1902 as an independent insurance agency in the Pittsburgh area. And in 1928, it began serving volunteer fire departments with a customized blanket and axe health policies. Today, we provide volunteer combination and career fire departments and emergency medical responders with a multitude of programs. We also offer special risk and transportation insurance programs. Provident's been named the top insurance workplace by the Insurance Business America magazine for the last 3 years. The programs that we offer, we have an accident and health policy that provides coverage for, and as part of that, if you're an accident and health client of ours, you and your family are entitled to use our first responder assistance program. We also have a 24-hour accidental death and dismemberment policy, group life policy for you and your members, critical illness and cancer policies. And we also now do what we refer to as our Fire Plus property and casualty insurance. If you're a Fire Plus client of ours, you're also entitled to, you and your members, free access to our Fire Plus online training academy. And now we're going to move into the program with Jack Sullivan on roadway traffic incidents.
Thank you, Ed.
Jack, I'm going to mute my speaker and it's all yours.
All right, very good. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. We're going to talk about roadway incident safety. Ed's going to stop sharing his screen. I'm going to try and make mine work here. Stand by. Here we go. All right, you should be able to see the full slides now. And what I wanted to start with is that even though we're talking about roadway incident safety, I want to make sure that you understand that we're addressing all kinds of roadways that you can be operating on. So this is not just for those folks that are operating on high-speed limited access highways like interstates and freeways, but also for those folks that are operating in rural communities, suburban residential streets, even parking lots and shopping centers have been places where first responders have been struck and injured or struck and killed. And we're going to try and cover just some select topics today because we've got a time limit. My problem in years past, when I first started talking about this subject about 23 years ago, was finding enough material to fill up a half an hour. Now my problem is trying to whittle down the material to fit in an hour program like this. So I chose a few select topics that we'll cover today. I can't cover everything that we know about this subject, but we're going to talk about some of the things that we've learned in the last 23 years. And Ed mentioned the incident that got me started on this subject. I'm kind of an unwilling instructor, as it comes down to. I never envisioned that I would be spending my time talking about this subject and teaching people what we've learned about it since this incident that occurred in March of 1998 on the Pennsylvania Turnpike near the Downingtown interchange. The folks in the department that I retired from just a little while before this incident occurred, I left when I was a lieutenant and safety officer in the station, responded to a motor vehicle crash involving a vehicle that spun out on the roadway by themselves and ended up in a ditch line on the side of the turnpike. When the Good Samaritan who witnessed the incident called 911 that day and reported the incident, he answered all the questions the dispatcher asked about. And that was, are there any injuries? I'm not sure. Is there anybody in the vehicle? Yes. Can they get out? I don't know. Is the vehicle on fire? Do you see smoke? I see smoke coming from underneath the hood. And that resulted in a dispatch for a motor vehicle crash with Lineville Fire Company responding an engine and a heavy rescue, and Euclid Ambulance Corps down the street responding an ambulance with 2 EMTs on board. At the same time, a state police officer who was about 45 miles away and coming was dispatched to the incident, and the turnpike maintenance crew from the DeVault maintenance shed a few miles away was dispatched to act as the safety service patrol to set up the temporary traffic controls at the incident scene, display an arrow board, and get traffic to stay away from the actual crash scene. What you see on the screen now is the results about 40 minutes after they had arrived on the scene, when the tractor trailer overturned and wiped through the incident scene, striking 10 of the fire and EMS personnel that were on scene that day, 2 EMTs and 8 firefighters. Firefighter Dave Good did not survive this incident and did not get to go home at the end of the day. And in March of 1998, as we started to do some research to see if there was something that we could do on the Pennsylvania Turnpike to make the scene safer, what we found was that there were not many fire departments in the country who would address the subject of roadway incident safety or highway incident safety. I found 3 fire departments: Fairfax County, Virginia, Phoenix, Arizona, and Plano, Texas. All had standard operating procedures for operating on a highway, a high-speed limited access highway. When I contacted those folks through the help of the U.S. Fire Administration, I got copies of the SOPs that those folks were using to teach their staff how to deal with roadway and highway incidents. And the funny thing was that the SOP was identical except for the name of the fire department on the top of the form. We're not really sure which fire department was the first to come up with the SOP. We know the other 2 reproduced it, which was fine at the time, but they were the only 3 fire departments that we could find at that time in 1998 that it really addressed the subject in any way, shape, or form. And that was how I met Ron Moore in Plano at the time, who has since moved on to other departments. And those guys were very helpful in giving us some tips and tricks and ideas to use at highway incidents that we did not know of before. And what I'm going to do today is share what we've learned not only from them 23 years ago, but also what we've learned over the last 23 years and talking to a lot of people in law enforcement, Department of Transportation, and towing and recovery industry, of course, fire and EMS. And it seems like no matter what we do these days, we still have a problem with people running into our emergency vehicles. It doesn't matter how many flashing lights are on, what color your rig is, how many chevrons are on the back. There are examples on almost a daily basis of somebody striking an emergency vehicle or an emergency responder, and that's resulting in injuries or fatalities in some cases. It's happening in a wide variety of different environments. It does not have to be a high-speed limited access highway like you see here. It happens in a variety of different places. This incident occurred last year in August in Rowan County, North Carolina, along Interstate 85. They were working a truck fire in the middle of the night when 3 of their apparatus were struck by a tractor trailer who approached the scene after they had been on location for a long period of time, and for whatever reason, struck 3 of the fire apparatus as opposed to moving over and passing the scene safely. No fatalities, 1 minor injury for 1 firefighter that was at the scene that day. But at the same time, this is just an example of no matter what we seem to do, we still have people who are being struck on a regular basis. It happens to EMS and ambulances. It happens to fire police. It happens to fire apparatus. It happens to police cars on a regular basis, probably even more so than we see on the fire and EMS side of the house. It happens to safety service patrols who are working for DOT to set up temporary traffic controls at roadway incidents where they're available. And not everybody has access to safety service patrols, but they perform a valuable service where they're available, and they're getting hit too. And they're better equipped in some cases. Flashing arrow boards, message boards, lots of cones, lots of flares, advanced warning signs, the people to deploy them appropriately, and yet they're still getting hit in a lot of situations too. And our friends in the towing and recovery industry probably have more of a problem than any of the rest of us. You'll see when I share some stats with you in just a second that they probably have more fatalities in the course of a year than some of the other services. And very often they're operating on their own. They don't have necessarily the advantage of a blocking vehicle behind them, although a lot of them are starting to move in that direction to provide a safety vehicle of some sort when they're dispatched to a road or highway. But at the same time, there's still an awful lot of the towing and recovery industry that work by themselves on a daily basis. And then the thing that we always thought was the best temporary traffic control device at a roadway incident or work zone was the flashing arrow board and an attenuator trailer or attenuator pad in the back. And here's an example of what we're seeing an increase in on a daily basis, that even pre-planned work zones with advanced warning signs and attenuators and flashing arrow boards and message boards are also getting hit. So the type of driver that we're dealing with today is very different than the type of driver we were dealing with 23 years ago. Here's an example of an incident that occurred in 2019 in July. If you look at this incident, there's a dump truck that blew through a road closure involving a lot of police cars, basically went through them, struck an ambulance and pushed it into a fire engine at the scene of a motor vehicle crash. There were no injuries or fatalities in this secondary crash, but it could have been a disaster if you think about it. And in this case, the lanes were closed. There was no traffic passing through in that area. It could have been a much bigger disaster. The other thing that we're seeing is it's not only just the responders that are being injured or killed. In some cases, it's the striking drivers. And this is an example from 2019 down in Florida, where a driver, for whatever reason, approaching an incident scene, struck one of the safety service patrols at the incident scene that resulted in a passenger having serious injuries and the driver being killed in the crash. You see at the bottom, I've indicated it was just a routine call. And the reason I have that there on some of these slides is because one of the things we've heard over time after an incident like this, when somebody's talking to the news media or talking about the incident itself, many times somebody will say something to the effect of, it was just a routine call. It was just a routine incident. It was the kind of incident we respond to multiple times a day. In most cases, there's nothing unusual about these incidents. It's the same kind of thing that happens on a regular basis, day in and day out. And yet, for some reason, somebody does something different or unexpected and ends up running into an emergency vehicle or running into the personnel operating at the incident scene, causing injuries or death to either the responders or the drivers who are striking the vehicles. Here's another example that occurred in Delaware. Once again, they had been working at an incident scene when a car approached at highway speeds and ran into the back of one of the blocking fire apparatus, causing death to the driver in that particular car. So when we talk about these incidents, obviously my first goal is the safety and survival of the emergency responders, fire, EMS, police, any DOT safety service patrols that might be there, towing and recovery personnel that are assisting you, DOT personnel or public works that might be helping you with traffic control. But we also need to be thinking about the other motorists on the roadway and the victims that were responding to help in the first place. We've got to be looking at the big picture and all of those people that are involved. In 2019, the Emergency Responder Safety Institute tracked 44 fatalities total for emergency responders being struck by vehicles at incident scenes. 41 of those personnel were considered to be on duty. 3 were considered to be off duty. For example, a firefighter just coming off of a 24-hour shift in a career department, leaving the station early in the morning, 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, driving home and witnessing a car crash or a motor vehicle collision of some sort, or somebody struggling to fix a flat tire. Probably most of the people that are on this webinar today are what I consider to be type A personalities. We're action oriented. We tend not to ignore things. We tend to jump in and get involved. And at least 3 of these off-duty personnel decided to stop and help somebody that needed help on the side of the road, and subsequently were struck and killed at the incident. And we're starting to track the off-duty incidents as we become aware of them now, because let's face it, if are any of us in emergency services, and in particular the volunteer fire and EMS services, are we ever really off-duty? We're probably on duty 24 hours a day. If something needs to be done, we're going to jump in and help. So for 2019, 18 of the fatalities were in the law enforcement community, 14 in towing and recovery, 9 in fire and EMS. And some of the activities that were going on at the time, 17 of the fatalities occurred where there were disabled vehicles. And that's primarily the towing and recovery industry there. 12 involved personnel who were struck and killed at motor vehicle crash scenes. And I can tell you, after looking at these incidents over the last 20 plus years, you probably have the highest probability of being struck by a vehicle at the scene of a motor vehicle crash that you respond to, regardless of the discipline that you're working for. In the fire and EMS community, about 60% of the struck by fatalities over the years are related in some way, shape, or form to operating on the scene of a motor vehicle crash. Law enforcement had fatalities from traffic stops, other law enforcement activities like searches or assisting a disabled vehicle in some cases, or doing some other kind of law enforcement activity. 2 of the fatalities in 2019 were related to firefighters operating at fire scenes, and 1 was an EMT that was struck and killed in a non-emergency standby type of situation. In 2020, the numbers jumped up a little bit to 46 fatalities. 43 of those personnel were on duty. 3 again were off duty. 17 were law enforcement officers, 21 in the towing and recovery industry, 4 in fire and EMS, and 3 safety service patrol operators were killed in 2020. And the reason that we're tracking all of these disciplines is because the reality is these folks are all doing the same job, same type of job, along the roadway or on a highway where there's moving traffic in the area. We're all kind of in the same hazard zone. We need to learn from all of these incidents, not just the ones that are affecting our personnel in the fire and EMS community. So in 2020, the activities, again, very high disabled vehicles. And again, most of those fatalities were related to the towing and recovery industry. 9 motor vehicle crash scenes, 4 traffic stops, 5 incidents involving law enforcement deploying stop sticks, 5 other law enforcement activities, 2 in debris removal, and 1 fire and EMS standby that was non-emergency was a fatality. So here we are in 2021, and you would hope that it's getting better. We're in June, we're almost at July, we're at about the halfway point. We've already had 27 fatalities from being struck by vehicles at emergency scenes, 15 in law enforcement, 10 in towing and recovery, and 1 in fire and EMS. The fire and EMS fatality this year was a fire police officer in Delaware who unfortunately was struck by an emergency vehicle backing up at an incident scene. So there's all kinds of different incidents that can occur. We've got to be aware, have situational awareness in 360 degrees, and thinking all the time when we're standing anywhere near where moving traffic could be. And probably the most significant and prevalent causal factor that we see in all of these incidents is what we at Responder Safety like to call D drivers. They're the drivers out there operating vehicles who are drunk, drugged, drowsy, disgruntled, disturbed, disrespectful, distracted. We've seen plenty of that. And those folks who are drag racers, who are driving too fast for conditions. Now, we all know people that like to drive fast. Problem is they continue to drive fast when it's raining heavily and water is ponding on the road, when there's black ice forming on the roadways, when it's snow or fog, or anything that should cause people to normally slow down. Vehicles today have far more capabilities than most of the drivers, and people continue to drive at excessive speeds for the type of road conditions and environmental conditions that they're operating in. So the D drivers are what we got to be thinking about. To help illustrate that point, I've got this quick video that was shot from the back of a DOT vehicle with an attenuator and a flashing arrow board. I'm going to repeat this loop a couple of times. Notice that there is no traffic in the center lane to the left of this particular vehicle. Could have very easily merged into the left lane. And if you look again on the next loop, you'll notice that just before she ran into the attenuator without applying the brakes, she put her turn signal on like she was going to merge into the left lane, and could have, but didn't, and didn't apply the brakes either, but ran into the attenuator that was on the back of the construction truck with a large yellow amber flashing arrow. I'm not sure how we're supposed to defend ourselves on the roadway if we have drivers that can't avoid a situation like this. So let's talk about the things you can do or should be doing to help protect your personnel to the best of your abilities. And one is multi-agency cooperation, collaboration, communication, and training. Now, I hope most of you have done some sort of traffic incident management or roadway incident safety training for your personnel. Question is, how many of you did that training in collaboration with the other agencies that you work with on a regular basis? Did you do the training with law enforcement partners? Did you do the training involving DOT, safety service patrols, public works, the towing and recovery industry, or did you just do it amongst yourselves in the fire and EMS community? We encourage you to try and do some of that training with others also. We want to make sure that all of the different agencies at an incident scene are operating under a true unified command type situation where everybody's on agreement on what the incident action plan is going to be, and everybody knows what each agency is responsible for, and everyone is working in a coordinated fashion. Now, the reality is this doesn't happen all the time, but we do know that if you work at it on a regular basis, it can provide an effective and smooth and efficient operation where everybody gets their job done in the most effective and quick way to clear the road and get everybody out of harm's way. Probably the most effective training tool that we've seen for this particular topic is what we refer to as tabletop exercises. And I can tell you, it's not quite so much fun when I'm doing tabletop exercises with just fire and EMS personnel at the tabletop. It gets much more fun when we have personnel from law enforcement and DOT and some of the other agencies represented. And it gets even more fun, and it becomes a better learning experience when we force people to play other roles than what they typically do. So sometimes when we do these tabletops, firefighters can't act as firefighters. They have to act as law enforcement, or they have to act as EMS, or they have to act as a DOT safety service patrol, or maybe they represent the towing and recovery industry. And everybody in all the other disciplines has to take on a role that's different from their own role. And what that does is help you get a better perspective of what an incident looks like and what the incident action plan looks like from somebody else's perspective. And when you have all of the agencies represented around the table, you get a far better discussion and a far better learning experience than if everybody's on the same page when you come in. One of the things that we encourage on a regular basis, and it starts with dispatchers and call takers, if we have a minor accident where there's just minor property damage to the vehicles, there are no injuries, there are no fatalities, we want to encourage people to remove their vehicle from the operating lanes of the road or highway that they're on. So very often that message can be delivered initially by the dispatcher or call taker when they call 911. If there are no injuries and your vehicle is drivable, please move it off to the shoulder or a side street or into a parking lot or away from moving traffic. And of course, the response that the dispatchers often get is, well, I'm not moving until I get a police report or the police say it's okay to move it. Most of the states have some sort of an authority removal law or a driver removal law where they basically are required to move their vehicle, if it's drivable or movable, out of the operating lanes of travel, even before emergency services arrive on the scene. If the drivers haven't done it, when you arrive at the scene, whether you represent fire, EMS, law enforcement, or anybody else, you have the authority to move those vehicles. The only thing I caution fire and EMS folks to do, if you decide that you want to move the vehicles, given the circumstances, and law enforcement is not on location yet at the incident scene, but you know they're coming, we always recommend that you check with them first. Let them know what the situation is and check and see if it's okay for you to push, pull, or move the vehicle out of the operating lanes of the roadway. In most situations, they will say okay. If the situation involves some sort of injuries, you don't want to move the vehicles until law enforcement performs their investigation. So in a situation like this, it could be a move it or a work it incident. Just because there's an ambulance there doesn't mean there were any injuries. And just because it's a rural type setting doesn't mean we shouldn't move the vehicles and the emergency personnel that responded to the incident off of the operating lanes of the roadway if possible, onto a side street or into a parking lot or a driveway, something to get them away from the possibility of being struck by moving traffic anywhere near the roadway. Now, there are some incidents that we're going to have to deal with in a work it type environment. We are not going to be able to move every incident out of harm's way. So we've got to have a game plan on how we're going to deal with incidents like this. Make sure that your personnel know what your expectations are. We would expect that you have some sort of training and or SOP or standard operating guidelines to advise people what the things are that you want them to do when they arrive at an incident scene. And we'll talk about some of those things as we go through the session. But there's another kind of move it type situation that's developing that I want you to be thinking about also. And this is just one illustration of several that I've seen where emergency services is arriving on the scene. In this case, police have already blocked off the lanes. Now the engine is taking up a blocking position. Let's watch what happens as they deploy hose line for this particular vehicle fire. And this is coming out of California, by the way, for those of you that are interested. Notice where the hose line is going, and is traffic on that opposing lane protected in some way? Oh my goodness. How many of you have now included in your procedures at a vehicle fire to secure the vehicle that's on fire so that it doesn't roll after you arrive at the incident scene? And we've seen a number of different examples of this type of incident occurring. Our recommendation is that you should be taking initial steps to chock the wheels on the vehicle that's on fire, especially if it's not on level ground. And even if it's on level ground, we still recommend that you take steps to chock the wheels or put some kind of cribbing on them or whatever so that that vehicle doesn't move. Notice the firefighters that are operating the hose line now, where they're located, and the lack of protection for them in that opposing lane of traffic. So we've done a good job of blocking the lanes where the fire vehicle is, but those folks are operating in an area that's not protected by a blocking vehicle. And obviously we don't recommend that either. So this is a good example of a vehicle rolling that was on fire. It's been burning long enough. It's affected a short in the system, and many new vehicles nowadays have an electrical connection between the gear shift and the transmission. When fire impinges on those wires and causes a short of some sort, we're starting to see these vehicles rolling, especially if they're on a sloped surface. So keep that in mind. With that idea in mind, how many chock blocks do you have available to you on your fire vehicles? You still need to chock your vehicle too. Do you have additional chocks or some other materials that you can use to secure the vehicle that's on fire also? So one of the things I question folks on is, do you just have the chock blocks that came with your rig that's used to secure your rig, or do you have additional ones that you can use to secure the fire vehicle? Let's make sure that we're keeping both of those in mind. Blocking. We know that blocking works and protects emergency responders. It's been demonstrated time and time again in many different circumstances. In some documents and in some training, it's referred to as safe parking or safe positioned. I can tell you the safe positioned terminology comes from the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices that was written by the Federal Highway Administration. The MUTCD, as we refer to it, is in revision right now. It hasn't been revised for the last 10 years. They are working through draft comments and feedback that they got from the community when they put their draft out in about December of last year, I guess. And one of the things that I see happening that's going to make a difference for us is that they're removing the term safe positioned from the MUTCD. So the next version should not be using that terminology. Blocking is what we typically hear and use in the fire and EMS community of practice. And this is an example of what we're talking about when we talk about blocking. Using a heavy piece of apparatus, typically fire apparatus in most cases, parked on an angle with the wheels turned away from the work area, protecting the lanes, where the incident has occurred, and in many cases, one additional lane, what we refer to as lane +1 blocking, to protect the personnel and the victims that were responding to help in the first place. By parking your apparatus on an angle, you are sending a visual cue to traffic that is approaching the scene that your apparatus is stopped, parked, and not moving. It is more difficult for traffic approaching an incident scene when you are parked in line with traffic to tell that your vehicle is stopped, parked, and not moving. By putting it on an angle, you're doing a couple of things. Number one, you're providing more blocking area for the incident scene itself, but you're also sending that subtle message to approaching traffic that your rig is stopped, parked, and not moving. And a car approaching your incident scene at 70 miles an hour, especially with a distracted driver, might not realize that your rig is not moving if it's parked in line with traffic. That's one of the reasons why we encourage parking on an angle. The other reason is to make sure that we're giving a cue of some sort to the traffic, maybe which direction they should be going, or maybe we're protecting the pump operator if it's a vehicle fire, or protecting the loading area of an ambulance if it's a motor vehicle crash with injured parties. There's a variety of different things we can talk about with blocking, but this is a pretty good illustration of one way to do it. The idea is that when we park our rig on an angle, what we're forming is a temporary traffic control zone, which is one of the things that the MUTCD calls for. The idea is we don't want you to have to look over your shoulder every second that you're operating on the scene to worry about approaching traffic. We want that blocking vehicle to give us a temporary traffic control area where we can work to get the situation resolved as quickly as possible, to remove our personnel from the scene as quickly as possible, and to resume the normal flow of traffic. That's one of the things that we're trying to accomplish. So the terminology that we use typically is block right or block left. And this rig here is in what we call a block right position for an incident in the left-hand lane, or what we refer to as lane 1 in some cases, to protect the pump operator because you may be pulling hose lines off in this particular case. The other option that you have is to park in a block left position for maybe a medical assist call, like in this situation here, where we're not pulling any hose lines. We don't have to worry about a pump operator standing at a pump panel on the side of the rig, and we're protecting the incident scene where EMTs or firefighters will be operating, and at the same time kind of giving a subtle message to approaching traffic that they need to merge left to avoid the incident scene and proceed past at a safe rate of speed. Boy, if we could accomplish that to get people to move over and slow down at these incidents, that would be a big win. I'm not sure why we can't get folks to do that on a regular basis. We also need to be aware that when we do park in a blocking position, we have got to block the lanes involved, including the shoulder in some cases, completely. We cannot leave a rabbit hole open for those folks to, in some cases, take the opportunity to go, I think I can fit through there. And as you can see in this picture, that's exactly what happened in this particular situation. A car approaching the incident scene in the right-hand lane, saw the fire truck ahead, attempted to merge into the left lane or center lane in this picture to pass the incident scene safely, but because of traffic in that lane, could not do it as she approached the incident. And instead of stopping or slowing down on the approach, she decided to dive to the right and pass on that shoulder, past the fire vehicle. Fortunately, there were no personnel standing next to the rig at the time, and come back into traffic and into the flow of traffic and keep going down the roadway. This could have been a disaster if personnel had been stationed on the officer's side of the rig. Didn't happen in this particular case. Let me give you an example of how that happens. This is probably the best video clip I can share with you that talks about that. I want you to watch the white van in the right lane. So we're exiting the interstate and we're taking one of the exits off. Watch what happens at the top of the ramp. There's a safety service patrol vehicle blocking the right lane. The van attempted to merge into the left lane, but was going too fast for conditions, couldn't merge left, and instead dove to the right. Didn't really apply the brakes at all until after he was past the safety service patrol rig. The safety service patrol operator, which is walking past the engine, he had been down at the incident scene. Normally, he would have been standing on the right side of his rig. He was fortunate in this case that none of the responders were struck and injured or struck and killed. We need to do a better job of ratcheting up our advanced warning skills and techniques or policies or procedures. What we need to do is make sure that drivers know that there's something unusual going on up ahead and that they need to slow down, pay attention, and in many cases move over if they're on a multi-lane highway. When we talk about advanced warning, we're talking about getting the motorist attention before they get to the incident, transition from their normal driving, pay attention and move over to an adjacent lane or different lane if necessary, and follow whatever temporary traffic controls are in place at the time. Those temporary traffic controls might include advanced warning signs, cones, flares, electronic flares, chemical flares, emergency vehicles of some sort, like a fire police vehicle or a safety service patrol or some other type of emergency vehicle. We know that in places where they're using these pink fluorescent signs, which are called for in the MUTCD, that they do get good results from many of the drivers. For those drivers who are literally not looking out the windshield, they're not very effective. But for drivers who are paying attention, this tells them that there's something unusual going on up ahead. There aren't too many places on a typical roadway these days where you'll see fluorescent pink on anything. So these signs do catch people's attention and at least give them an indication that something is going on up ahead. These signs are most valuable when they're anywhere from 250 to 1,000 feet or more before an incident scene or before people encounter the queue or backlog from an incident. It's tough to get those signs in exactly the right position, so in many cases we depend on other agencies to provide advanced warning using emergency vehicles like a police car, a fire police vehicle, another fire unit of some sort, a DOT truck of some kind, a safety service patrol, something to get people's attention and tell them to pay attention to where they're going and follow the temporary traffic controls in place. We recommend using cones and flares to move traffic, transfer them from one lane to another to pass an incident scene where it's appropriate. Unfortunately, we probably don't do the best job of deploying those cones and flares. And what I'm going to share with you is what we've learned from the safety service patrol industry, who do this multiple times a day. Instead of taking the cones and laying them out from the emergency vehicle back across the lane of traffic, what they recommend is taking your cones off of your apparatus and spacing those cones out along the shoulder of the road where you're going to close a lane. Once you have the cones spaced out as far back as you're going to go from your emergency vehicle, then start placing those cones at the fog line at the furthest point where you're going to start the taper to move traffic over to an adjacent lane. Always keep an eye on traffic. Wait for a break in traffic, step out and place another cone. Keeping an eye on traffic, come back towards your emergency vehicle about another 10 paces, wait for a break in traffic, put another cone out, and continue the same operation, always keeping an eye on approaching traffic until the last cone is on the line dividing the lanes that you're closing off closest to your emergency vehicle. There is no one perfect safe way to deploy cones or flares at an incident scene, but this technique is what the safety service patrol guys tell us is the safest way to do it, as opposed to starting with the cone closest to the emergency vehicle and working back to the fog line. You want to start at the furthest point and work back towards the emergency vehicle, always keeping an eye on traffic. Some of the other features and new technology or products that we're seeing out on the street that have been put into use in a variety of areas. Electronic flares are getting better in terms of their technology. The first generation of electronic flares weren't very impressive, but some of the products that are available out on the marketplace today are well worth a look. Maybe easier for you to maintain and use than some of the old style chemical flares, which are still very effective at roadway incidents. A number of fire departments around the country have started to use portable speed bumps like you see on the right side of the screen. These roll up in the satchel like you see in the picture and fit fairly easily into a compartment on a fire vehicle. South Carolina fire departments have been especially complimentary of the reaction that they get from drivers for these portable speed bumps at the incident scenes. What they'll do in some cases is stop the traffic temporarily, deploy one or two of these portable speed bumps. Typically only takes one firefighter to do each one, and then allow traffic to resume. The idea is to deploy these in advance of your incident scene so that they're slowed down as they get to the incident scene or work area where all your personnel are. And we've seen examples where this has gotten a very good reaction from drivers, does get them to slow down before they proceed across. Don't forget that we can still block in a rural type road environment too. Even though that we don't have multiple lanes, we can still position our apparatus on an angle, protect the work area, but we've got one more step we've got to do if we're only in a 2-lane roadway type situation like you see in this picture. Now we also have to provide for manual traffic control so that we don't let drivers manage the traffic flow themselves and cause a problem with a potential secondary crash involving a head-on collision. Somebody has got to manually control the traffic in a situation like this. If you do not have the resources on scene to do that, then close the road until you have adequate resources at the scene to be able to control the flow of traffic past the incident scene in the open lane of travel. Don't let motorists figure it out for themselves. Always, always, always remember that cone signs and flares only suggest what we want motorists to do. And those of you that have been in the business for a long period of time and have spent any time at all on the street have probably seen examples where motorists will drive through a flare or cone pattern, disregarding all of the signals because they literally are not paying attention to where they're driving on a regular basis. Let's talk a little bit about what we refer to as fire apparatus conspicuity. How visible are your fire apparatus at an incident scene? And there's a few things that we've done to improve visibility of our apparatus. The reflective graphics that we put on the apparatus, the high visibility chevrons that are now required on the back of apparatus, traffic arrow devices that we might see on some apparatus, like the back above the hose bed on this one, the emergency warning lights that are on our apparatus. All of these things together work together to provide conspicuity for our apparatus when they're operating out on the roadway. So a few years ago, the NFPA put some specifications out in the 1900 standard, or what is the new standard will be 1900. It was 1901 at this point. Calling for this color combination and this orientation of chevrons on the back of the rigs. The idea being fluorescent and reflective, the fluorescent features making it more highly visible in daylight conditions, and the reflective features making it more visible in nighttime or low light conditions. The color combination was chosen because of experience with that color combination over in Europe and the UK. But in my world, I guess I'm more interested in making sure that whatever color combination you pick, and we're seeing a lot of different color combinations for chevrons on the back of apparatus these days, that it should meet the test of fluorescent and reflective. So this color pattern here that you see that was actually done long before the NFPA standard came out meets that test of fluorescent and reflective. It provides for nighttime and daylight conditions for better visibility, but it's a different color combination. As long as you're using fluorescent and reflective features, I think you're going to accomplish the same idea or the same goal. Here's what you'll see on some rigs. There'll be a color combination like this on the back end. Remember back in the early days, we, for the most part, had warning lights that consisted of one beacon ray on the top of our apparatus. 60s and 70s, this was more than adequate to warn people that were approaching an incident scene that there was some sort of unusual circumstances or emergency ahead. How do you think this kind of lighting package would work these days for helping for your safety at an incident scene? Probably not adequate to get people's attention. If you had an antique apparatus under that light, it might get people's attention just because it's unusual. But we need to talk about the emergency lighting at incident scenes these days because we've heard loud and clear from a lot of different people that our warning lights, the LED packages, especially at nighttime and low light conditions, are excessively bright and create a glare situation that prevents motorists from understanding what they're supposed to do when they pass the scene. They can't see personnel that are operating around the emergency vehicles at the incident scene, and they're obviously clearly distracted by all the warning lights. Add to that, additionally, spotlights and floodlights that we might deploy at an incident scene, especially at nighttime. We've got to make sure that they're aimed at the work area so we can see what we're doing, but not causing a glare problem for motorists approaching the incident from any direction. So that means the driver operators need to spend time making sure they position those floodlights in an appropriate fashion to light the work area, but not create a glare problem. And even with all of these lights and fluorescent and reflective graphics and things like that, we still have plenty of examples where workers have been struck and injured or struck and killed at incident scenes where these lights are being used. So we've started to look at the problem and tried to decide what the best way is to handle things. And when I say we, it's a combination of the folks in the field and those manufacturers that are making the warning lights and emergency warning devices that we see on vehicles these days. And what they're doing is looking at the intensity of the flash, the frequency of the flash, whether or not the flash head goes off completely or maintains some of its visibility during the flash pattern. And of course, there's a lot of conversation these days about colors of warning lights. One of the things that we're doing right now at Responder Safety is a contract with the U.S. Fire Administration to do some testing on emergency light packages and what we can do to make them more effective at warning the public about an emergency scene, but also permitting them to see what's going on so that they can pass the scene safely. That testing is underway right now down in Daytona, Florida. The report should be out soon. We're learning a variety of different things. It started with some testing that we did in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, back in November of 2018, I guess, where one of the manufacturers helped us to look at the various types of flash patterns and various intensity levels for the emergency warning lights to a crew of about 100 people who gave us feedback on what they felt was the most effective lighting package or way to use the lighting package at an emergency scene. How fast the flashes were, how bright they were, whether they were staggered on either side or synchronized in some way. This is what the typical lighting package looks like on a new fire apparatus being delivered today. When you put 3 or 4 emergency vehicles together at one incident scene, it creates a lot of chaos and a lot of confusion for the people who are trying to approach the scene and pass it safely. I think, although the results aren't in yet, that what we're going to start to see are lighting packages like this. We want bright and flashing lights when we're responding to an incident. But when we stop at an incident scene, what we're looking at is keeping the light packages so they never completely extinguish. They always maintain at least about 10% of their intensity level so that they outline the truck. So when we're responding, we want all of the lights to work in a chaotic fashion to get people's attention. But when we stop and park at the incident scene, we'd rather have a slower, more gentle approach, if you want to put it that way, to the emergency lighting that outlines the rig so that they can see where it is and see personnel operating around it at the incident scene. I think this is what we're going to end up seeing as time goes on. And I know the NFPA 1901 committee is looking at adding a third emergency lighting mode called nighttime blocking that will probably look something similar to that. So we expect to see that very soon. The technology in emergency lighting is advancing quickly. And one of the things that we're also seeing is that they literally synchronize the emergency lights on vehicles when they're parked at an incident scene. So this is what law enforcement can do these days. We don't have any examples in fire and EMS yet, but the first vehicle on the scene sets up a lighting pattern that they feel is most effective for the situation. Any additional emergency vehicles approaching the scene, when they stop and put their unit in park, it automatically synchronizes the lights between vehicles. So they're all displaying the same lighting pattern to convey a similar message to motorists that are trying to pass the scene. We're coming a long way. One of the things that we found in the testing that we're doing down in Florida is that maybe we also need to look at the chevrons as being, in some cases, too bright in addition to the emergency warning lights on the back of the rigs. There are different grades of reflective material that are available for the chevrons on the back of the rigs. And it might be better, the final report's not done yet, but it might be better to use a lower grade of reflective material so that it doesn't overwhelm the glare from the headlights of approaching vehicles. More to come on that particular subject, but we're getting some information now that we never had access to before without doing some testing. We like arrow devices to be as big as possible and as high as possible on your rigs. Get them up as high as you possibly can, preferably over the hose bed, and use lights that are bigger than we see in the average light stick on the back of some rigs. Some departments are also installing arrows on the side of their rig so that when you park your rig on an angle, the arrow device is also more visible to approaching traffic. The idea is to synchronize the arrow device on the back of the truck with the arrow device on the side of the truck to convey a consistent message to the approaching traffic which way you want them to go to pass the incident scene. This is just one small example I've got of how to synchronize those arrows. But the idea of putting the arrow on the side of the rig is a good one that I think we probably should see more often. You can do this on EMS vehicles too. The lighting package that you see here is becoming more common, and these lights can be arranged so that they can also provide a directional arrow type of feature to approaching traffic when EMS is the only vehicle on the scene. So there's a few ways to do that, and all of the manufacturers have these capabilities. Those of you that are fortunate enough to have fire police, make sure they're equipped properly. We see an awful lot of fire police vehicles now being equipped with arrow boards or message boards, which is great. That helps to convey good information to the public and direct them which direction they need to go. Some fire departments have tried to install arrow boards and message boards on the top of full-size fire apparatus. It's tricky. You end up losing some space for some other equipment somewhere along the way. Some departments have decided it's important for the number of times they respond to roadway incidents. Chief Judy Thill gave us a picture of one of her newer units where they relocated one of the message boards that they had on an older unit onto the new unit. When they run out on the interstate or a multi-lane high-speed highway on a regular basis, temporary traffic control becomes very important. It is possible to do it. You might not like it because it might not look great in a parade, but it's very effective out on the roadway. In Livonia, Michigan, they equipped all of their battalion chiefs' vehicles with a flip-up arrow board as part of their light package on the light bar on the roof. We see all kinds of advancements being made, including some departments who are now deploying attenuator trailers or pads of some sort behind an emergency vehicle like Grand Rapids, Michigan, or blocker vehicles, which are repurposed reserve apparatus that are being used strictly for blocking to protect frontline expensive apparatus that's still being used to respond to incident scenes. Irving, Texas was probably the first one to come up with that idea, and that's been very successful. They added additional arrows to these rigs, took all the firefighting equipment off of them, and used them as a blocker at incident scenes to protect not only the personnel and the victims, but also the frontline apparatus from being struck because of the number of fire apparatus that we're seeing being struck at roadway incidents. On occasion, these vehicles are struck hard enough that they're totaled, but the value of these reserve rigs is far lower and far less than what we see in the frontline rigs. And the guys in Irving have decided that they're going to make known when their vehicle has done the job of blocking and protecting the responders on the scene by placing a sticker on the side of the rigs every time they're hit. After Irving did it, other departments in Texas have started to do the same thing. And Grand Prairie, Texas just recently deployed 2 reserve apparatus where they installed attenuators on the back to use as their blocking vehicles. So we now have examples of fire vehicles with attenuators on the back being used for temporary traffic control at incident scenes. What's coming toward us in the future? Connected vehicle technology. It's going to help us greatly to be able to convey a message electronically to a smartphone, a navigation system, an infotainment system in a vehicle that basically warns people audibly in their vehicle as they approach an emergency that there is an emergency scene ahead. This capability is out there today with some digital alerting technology from companies like Haas Alert and Makeway Safety. You put a transponder on your emergency vehicle. When you activate the emergency warning lights, it automatically transmits information to the cloud, which can then be downloaded into navigation apps like Waze or Google Maps or whatever other type of technology you're using that will give you an audible indication ahead of time that there's an emergency scene ahead or that an emergency vehicle is approaching. The last thing I'm going to talk about today is autonomous vehicles. We're starting to see an increase in the number of situations where an autonomous vehicle, like a Tesla operating in autopilot mode, have struck emergency vehicles. The problem is that these vehicles do not avoid a fixed object in the roadway. They send a warning to the driver, and the driver needs to take over at that point and either stop or navigate around the obstruction in the roadway. Unfortunately, many Tesla operators have gotten very complacent about driving duties when they're operating these vehicles and don't respond quickly enough in a situation where they're warned that there's an obstacle in the roadway ahead. So we know of a half a dozen or more incidents where Teslas have run into parked emergency vehicles incident scenes. We're looking for ways to prevent this and to improve the situation. We still have a lot to learn. We have numerous resources on everything I've talked about today and more about roadway incident safety on our respondersafety.com website. One of the places that you can use some of our resources is for public information and public education. We need to teach drivers how to react to emergency vehicles along the roadway. There are a number of resources available to you for free on the PIO and Public Education Resources page, like a video on how to safely pass an emergency scene that you can show to community groups, high school students who are getting their learner's permit or their driver's license, or anybody else that needs to hear the message. As you plan for your open houses in October of this year around Fire Prevention Week, don't forget to add this particular subject to your list of things that you want to convey to the public. A video on Move It and what we talked about in getting the drivers to move damaged vehicles off the side of the road is available that you can use in whatever environment you have available to you. All of this stuff can be easily found on our website. Look for the blocks on the left-hand side of the homepage at respondersafety.com for direct links that will take you to some of these resources that allows you to convey that message to the general public. I've taken a bunch of time. I know there's probably been some questions. I'd be glad to try and take some of those questions, Ed, now. Maybe you've been watching what's going on in the chat section. What do we need to address?
All right, so we'll start with the questions and the answers here. We would also appreciate any SOG please send to. And then Steve, and it's from Steve, and he included his email address.
Steve, you can go to our website and click on the resources tab and put in the search box SOP, or you'll actually see a drop-down list that includes SOPs. There is a draft sample SOP in Word format that can be modified to suit your individual department needs very easily. So you can download it right now.
Steve, if you have any troubles with that, you could email me at eman@providentins.com, and I'll get word to Jack that we need some help finding it and we can get you what you need. All right, let's see what we had down here in the chat feature and see what come up here. We were asked if the recording will be made available. Yes, this will be uploaded to the Provident YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube and type in a Provident, it'll open up all the previous webinars we've done, including the one we're doing today. Joshua made a comment that they've been using old vehicles for blocking since the 1980s, and he makes a valid point like you did, Jack. Much rather use an older vehicle than end up using a newer vehicle that would cost a whole lot more money,
Right.
And have it destroyed rather than something newer.
Glad to hear that. That's good.
Let's see if there's anything else. Comment on rural departments and POV response on roadways, especially POVs with strobe lighting. Jack, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, POVs direct to the scene are an issue, no question about it, especially if we still have departments that are responding POVs out onto interstates or high-speed limited access highways. So there was a report put out a few years ago, combination of the IAFC, National Volunteer Fire Council, talking about POVs direct to emergency scenes. If you'll send me a note or give me that person's contact information, I'll give them a link to that report. We kind of try to discourage that if we can, but the reality is in some areas, that's the only way to get emergency responders to an incident scene. One of the things that we talk about is making sure that if they respond directly to the scene, that they park downstream of the blocking vehicles or off the roadway into a side street or driveway, so they're not in the incident scene area itself.
Okay. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A block. I don't see anything else. Well, wait, another one just popped in. Have you ever had to deal with an unrealistic amount of bystanders at the accident scene?
Sure. And nowadays, everybody's a news reporter too, because everybody's got a smartphone with a camera, can take pictures and video and share it widely very quickly, which has resulted in a lot of uncomfortable situations. One of the things that we talk about and have actually addressed in our learning network is how to deal with bystanders at an incident scene, those uninvolved people at an incident scene who gather and sometimes cause trouble. Now, for those of you who are in areas where you have fire police or adequate law enforcement resources, it's usually up to them to take care of it. In other situations, you may have to dedicate some personnel to control the crowd. Obviously, you want to make sure you call for help early on if there's a need for additional resources that you don't have on the scene, because it's going to take them a little while to get there. Once again, we have some information available on the website on that. And if you'll send me their contact, I'll be glad to point them towards the resource.
Okay. I don't see anything else popping up in the Q&A, and it looks like we've covered everything that was in the chat.
Wow, you're letting me off easy today.
Well, I think you did such a good job of giving them information that there weren't a lot of questions to ask. Jack,
okay.
I got to thank you. I mean, every time I listen to your presentations, and I've listened to most of them in person, I learned something new. And I can tell you as a fire chief and a small volunteer department, when we get out on some of these open highways where the traffic's moving, I'm terrified. And I want to clear the scene as quickly as we can and get us off the highway and off the scene as quickly as we can for that very reason. And the primary reason is the distracted drivers. I mean, in spite of everything that is being done nationally to teach first responders how to protect themselves and the effort being made to educate motorists, there are still those people on the highway that just simply aren't paying attention.
Frequently.
And so, your information's been great. The bottom line, folks, is there's no way that we could cover one of Jack's typical presentations is probably 3.5, 4 hours. And he was just telling us earlier, he finally got, for the first time since May of last year, to do an in-person class last night. So, Jack's available to do those classes. I'm sure Jack doesn't want to advertise that widely because in July, he's gone on the road and isn't going to see home for a while. But the bottom line, folks, is if you need more information and you want to be able to take advantage of free online training, go to www.respondersafety.com. and look for the Responder Learning Network. And Jack, how many, you have 40 programs there now available?
Yeah, there's
free?
over 42 modules and covers all aspects of roadway incident safety. It's free to use. There is no charge for it, but you do have to register because it is a learning management network. So if you get interrupted while you're doing a module to respond to a call, when you come back, it'll take you to where you left off instead of having to repeat the whole module.
Yeah. And
you get certificates at the end of each one. And a lot of places offer CEs for it, but that's up to each individual state.
And if you want to take it one step further, your department can get enrolled and they can manage all those online courses for you. And someone in your department can assign those classes to the department members. It's basically an online management system, and you pay a one-time fee to be able to get that activated. And then your fire department could assign all those classes to you within the network. The bottom line is
secondary reporting.
Yep, secondary reporting. So check out www.respondersafety.com if you need more resources. For all those who registered for the webinar today, we'll be emailing you a link to the website. We'll also be uploading the presentation to our Provident YouTube page if you'd like to watch it again, or bring your department together and share it in a classroom. As a reminder, all our participants, will be a very short 5-question survey at the end of the program. Please take your time to complete it. It helps us schedule and decide what we need to do in the future. If you have any additional questions or need additional resources from today or into the future for that matter, you can email us at info@providentins.com and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And my one screen keeps going blank on me. So at the end of the day, this wraps up another Provident webinar. Please stay tuned for upcoming podcasts with Ed Klima from the First Responder Center for Excellence, when we're going to discuss the things that the First Responder Center for Excellence is doing for emergency services across the country. In fact, we're going to record that webinar or podcast tomorrow at 3:00, and Sam will have it uploaded here in the first week in July. Some of our future webinars here in the near future, we're going to have a panel discussion with Chief Chuck Flynn and others from the Volunteer Combination Officer section of the International Association of Fire Chiefs to talk about combination fire departments, how some of them and why some of them got started, how they're being managed today, and how well they're working. And also in the near future, I'll be doing a webinar related to good, better, and best practices related to reducing fire service risk or cancer risk within the fire service. So this concludes our webinar. Jack, again, thank you. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. And until we meet again, please stay healthy and stay safe.